What if I told you that the biggest lie in the government is not CPI? It's actually that inflation is over and under wraps. Now, the narrative for quite some time has been that inflation is done with. Why don't we lower interest rates? That's all we need to do. But today, the CPI numbers showed otherwise. Now, I'm not saying that the CPI numbers are always correct. Now, I always say that the biggest lie is CPI. But something very interesting happened with the numbers today. And let's dive in to what the F just happened with all of the inflation numbers. As we see, inflation rose to 2.7% in June. And it says pay attention to the core numbers here, right? Because at a glance, it's an increase. 2.4% in May, 2.7% here in June. Month over month increases 0.3%. Now, the core increase is at 2.9%, which is still larger than in May. And they're all saying that it's because of tariffs, right? That inflation is on the rise. It's only the beginning because the increasing effects from tariffs is now accelerating that. But it's not just that. It's U.S. consumer prices rising in June. And they're saying it's all because of these tariff pass-throughs, right? These numbers are just sign for what has to come, right? But they've been blaming tariffs for the entire time, right? They've been saying Trump's tariffs have caused the overall economic situation in Trump's America to not be great. But now they're saying, hey, now we're starting to finally feel the effects of Trump's inflation and his tariffs. So what is the real answer here? Well, in my opinion, it's a little bit of both. I think that everybody has been looking at these overall numbers and saying there feels like there's something wrong. The consumer is not as healthy as it seems. So because the consumer is not exactly where some might believe it is, well, why don't we give it a deeper look here and try to see exactly where it is? Because we're starting to see the latest inflation numbers. They're all picking up. Inflation rate at 2.7. Consumers pay more close attention to cumulative inflation, and prices are 24% more expensive today than they were before the cerveza sickness pandemic in February 2020. So the Federal Reserve, are they going to cut interest rates? We're going to get into that here in a minute. But the Federal Reserve cutting interest rate a full percentage point across 3 consecutive meetings in 24. Officials are taking a more cautious approach in 25. And Donald Trump wants them to cut 3 whole basis points. Or 300 basis points. 3 whole percentage points. Which is astronomical. You honestly do not see cuts like that. So if you don't see cuts like that and inflation is not under wraps, well, what did we see, right? We saw the U.S. Treasury yield absolutely skyrocket in flight on this news. You don't see these kind of jumps when it comes to the Treasury yield, and you don't see it that quickly based on that. Now, inflation has not been disappearing entirely. Prices aren't expected to drop to pre-inflationary levels, but it is slowing because the prices are sticky. Now, I like to use this example of getting your oil change at Jiffy Lube, because if you get your oil change at Jiffy Lube and it's goes from 25 to $50, I know that's an extreme example, but those prices are not going to go back down to $25 just because inflation has gone down. Excuse me, not so fast, right? Inflation is going to keep those prices right where they're at. They just don't need to increase anymore. At least that's the hope, that once prices increase, they stay somewhat stagnant. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes they drop dependent on the product. Maybe if it's something like eggs or something along those lines. But usually products and services, they don't necessarily fall back down. So inflation remains sticky. And despite Trump declaring inflation is dead, well, it's still, I wouldn't call it surging, but it's still increasing here month over month. We got all the way up to 2.7% here as inflation was surging. Consumer prices, and we're going to dive into this full box here because I think it's very, very interesting that we're seeing energy increase 3.8%. Even though we're seeing all these big drops, we're seeing energy services, utilities, and all items less than food and energy at 2.9%, which is kind of interesting. Why would you take everything that is necessary to live out of CPI? Look, I don't know. I don't report this data, but it is honestly somewhat shocking to see all of that, right? Exactly how we're going to see this inflationary pressure start to take off. Now, with energy prices, I think we should keep a very close eye on this because they're reporting some extremely high negative numbers, but those are the most volatile. We see them go up and down, up and down, up and down, and they're at 14.2% here for utility gas pipe services. So what does that mean? Is the Fed going to cut in 14 days and 16 hours? Well, after these numbers, that percent chance fell to 2.6%. Now, you guys who keep coming to this channel know I love looking at this, but it's interesting to see that it's dropped so dramatically. It's like falling off a cliff. When I first started tracking this after the last meeting, it was over 20%. Now we're starting to see it at 2.6%. So it looks like in 2 weeks, the Fed is not going to cut interest rates. And why is that? Well, because of these headlines here. Inflation's still on the rise. Despite what Donald Trump is saying, that inflation is dead, these CPI numbers are saying otherwise. And the Dixie actually reacted pretty positively to these high CPI numbers. It reacted by jumping up to 98. Now, for those of you guys who keep coming in, make sure you're hitting that subscribe button because I know 90% of you guys that keep coming back are not subscribed, but 98.5 at the Dixie is a whole hell of a lot higher than we were seeing less than a week ago when we were looking at this and it was at 97, right? We were at the low 97s with all of this. So you got to be cautious when it comes to how we're seeing this Dixie evolve. And how did the market react to all of this news? Well, the market was looking at it and saying, "Hey, you know what? We're going to go down today, down 0.4%, just so slightly. Even though year to date we're looking all right, at just under 6% on the way up. But there's a lot of macroeconomic factors going on here that, kind of make for a shaky economic time. I personally think that we haven't really gotten back or out of the inflationary pressures that Donald Trump got in when he, got elected as president. I think we're still kind of facing a lot of those issues. And so I think that we're going to start to see some more of these issues persist. But we're going to have to keep interest rates higher for a little bit longer in order to battle what we're seeing here. I'm going to keep this one short and sweet. So make sure you guys are hitting that subscribe button, telling a friend to tell a friend, and I'll catch you guys all at the next one.